Thanks. And now we have David McNally, who also teaches at York University and is active with the New Socialist Group. He is the author most recently of Global Slump, 2010, and Monsters of the Market, 2011. And both are members of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly.
Great, thanks very much. And also, I do want to start by thanking the Education Committee of the Workers' Assembly, Paul Kellogg in particular, who seems to have kept Sam and me in order, got us to the right place at the right time, and so on. But also Robert and Bate Satoon, once again, I want to underline what he said about the importance of this as a space for social justice gatherings in this city. I'm going to try to speak to the question of globalization at three different levels of analysis, and I don't want to suggest for a moment that that exhausts the discussion, but I hope that it will contribute at least to the kind of conversation we can have tonight. That will involve me in some cases in going down directions that weren't part of Sam's presentation, and maybe in one case allowing me to express some areas where I'm not entirely persuaded by the analysis that Sam has presented, even though that's not the kind of focus of the sort of three approaches or three, as I say, levels of analysis that I want to pursue. The first I've described in my own notes as the whole is greater than the parts. And that's at one level a theoretical and methodological claim, but I want to start there. And I want to start there because it seems to me, if we're going to talk about capitalism and globalization, we need to be clear that for dialectical analysis, you don't get to an understanding of the whole by adding its parts up. That the whole is greater than an attempt to sum up the parts. The whole, as Marx would tell us over and over again, actually is what determines the relationship among the parts within any organic system, and capitalism is an organic system in the sense in which it has dynamic processes by which it reproduces itself over time. And that's why I think it's important when Marx drew up his famous plan for his 6 books of Capital. Now, he never got more than about halfway through drafting parts of that project. But when he did, after the first 3 books, which are more or less covered in some kind of draft form in the 3 volumes that we have come to know as Capital, the 4th volume was to be on the state, the 5th was to be on foreign trade, and the final one was to be on the world market and world crises. And the importance of that to me is that that is the ultimate level of analysis, the world level. And so in terms of what Sam has said, I would want to introduce a host of qualifications. It seems to me that yes, states play a key role in institutionally trying to shape the process of globalization, but globalization is actually inherent in capital itself. The capital has a drive to overcome every barrier, temporal, spatial, geographic, and to implant its logic on a world scale. Having said that, it happens by way of immense contradictions, and it happens by way of enormous amounts of unevenness, and states centrally intervene to try to both sometimes contain and also shape in the interests of accumulation in particular territories of the globe, and so on. But I do see that that globalization, as I say, is inherent in capital itself, however much it unfolds as capitalism always does in contradictory ways. And I would underline as a kind of empirical test of that, the way in which the crisis of 2007 onwards subsumed even the largest, most powerful state on the planet, the major imperial state, the United States. In other words, rather than being able to control the economic events unfolding, these escaped the capacities of the state in the first instance to control them. They didn't want all 5 investment banks on Wall Street to melt down. It's true they reacted in a whole variety of ways to contain, as Sam says, but I do believe that there's a global logic at work that, as I say, states react to, but they aren't the authors of it in that sense. The second level at which I want to talk about it is what I've called Capital's Global History, Part 1. Yeah, there will be a Part 2, obviously, if I do that as a starting point. But what I want to emphasize in sort of having laid out a very general set of claims, which I think are important, is that the particular historical and spatial contexts in which capitalism emerges are crucial to the way in which its global dynamic develops. That is to say, capitalism emerges in a particular historical period, in a particular part of the world, and then its dynamics get unleashed from there. And world trade is, of course, a precondition of capitalism, as Marx will say over and over again. But we need to remember that trade on a very vast scale preceded capitalism in all kinds of historical contexts for very, very long periods of time. The challenge, therefore, for capital, originating most powerfully and crucially in Britain in the 17th, 18th centuries in the first instance, is then to win the battle to control this existing world market. And my own argument would be that I'll just assert it for you, is that once you truly get the consolidation of a bourgeois state in Britain, which I believe happens after the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, there's a state which is actually serving to prosecute the interest of capital, then that state has to win the battle to control world markets, and not surprisingly, its major rival ultimately in that regard becomes France. And so you get really 100 years war that isn't normally described in these terms. But it's a 100-year war from about 1680 onwards that Britain wins. And in winning it, you then get not just the unleashing of a capitalist market system into other parts of the world, but you get it happen by way of a colonial project. And as a result, capitalist globalization is inseparable from colonialism and empire, something that I want to come back to in a few minutes. In the first instance, that is to say across the 19th century, the process of capital's globalization is largely financial. That is to say, it's so-called portfolio investment driven, not foreign direct investment. You get significant changes beginning in the quarter century before the First World War, and then the period of the First World War, followed by the Great Depression, followed by the Second World War, and so on, really represents a contraction of that globalizing impetus of capital in some of the ways that Sam was alluding to when he talked about the first half of the 20th century. But I believe that with the rise of the multinational corporation based in the United States in the 1950s, and of financial networks associated with them, capital starts to globalize in ways that particular states may be happy with, but actually outruns their capacities. I believe that states start to play catch up with what capital is doing, and I think the most dramatic example of this is that one of the, I think, biggest faults in many analyses of neoliberalism is that they say globalization and financialization happened with the wave of legislation in the 1980s and 90s that deregulated financial markets and so on and so forth. I don't think that's true at all. I think that by the 1960s, there was a stateless financial market called the Eurodollar market. It was completely outside the control of states, and it drove a process of deregulation in global financial markets. The first major legislation in this regard is 1980 in the United States, where they start to significantly deregulate financial and monetary markets. But in fact, there was already a massively deregulated financial market. States, as I said earlier, try to react to contain, control, and construct grooves, channels in which these globalizing processes happen. But I do see them in that case as well as capital-driven in the first instance. Now, what's also crucial about this period is that we get the construction of global production chains in a way that was not true of capital's 19th century and early 20th century era of globalization. The creation of global production chains, the rise of foreign direct investment, where you are now both getting branch plants of multinational corporations, but more significantly, production systems that are genuinely transnational, with components coming in 1, 2, 3, and nowadays we know sometimes as many as 15 different national sites where components are being produced for the end product. That emergence of global production chains is a product of the much more recent history. And I also believe that financial globalization tended in the first instance to track that. The emergence of global banks was fundamentally about servicing the multinational corporations that were involved in these production chains. Obviously, finance and distribution networks follow. And the final point I want to speak to, which is back to the global history of capitalism, part 2, is what it means to think about globalized social relations. And here I want to suggest ways in which I believe we have really a very serious set of theoretical and practical political tasks to catch up our own theory and practice with the way in which world capitalism has developed. It seems to me that the strength of a variety of classical Marxist theorizations of the world system was to talk about the ways in which the capital wage labor relationship gets extended, in which it moves from being set up in one part of the world, predominantly Britain and parts of Europe and then North America, to become increasingly the dominant class relationship on the planet. I think there was an additional strength in some theorizations to recognize the processes of uneven and combined development that can characterize all of this. But I actually think that overall, Marxist analysis has been patchy, inconsistent, and sometimes weak with respect to colonization, race, and gender as actually central aspects of the globalization of these social relations on a world scale. It's obvious, of course, that slavery and colonialism are part of the story. Marx tells us this in Part 8 of Capital Volume 1, the famous primitive accumulation of capital story. He talks there about the extirpation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He's aware that the story of capital is a global story, but he has no theorization of race. That's something which has to come later, and where, while I think there is some important work within the Marxist tradition, I think by and large the Marxist tradition has lagged behind. That someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who has both one foot within the Marxist camp and one foot out, plays a crucial role, for instance, in identifying the problem of the color line as an absolutely central problem of the 20th century. And I think that laid down a challenge to our own understanding of Marxism, of globalization for Marxists, the way in which the reproduction of the system globally is also the reproduction of systemic racism as a global set of social relationships. And here I want to say just a couple of words about the question of gendered relationships here. I think some of the most important work in Marxist feminism over the last 30 years or so has been with respect to so-called social reproduction theory. That is to say, the attempt to theorize capitalism not simply as a set of sites of value production for capital, but also to theorize the ways in which households of multiple forms are crucial in the reproduction of all of those social relations. And while I think it is deeply flawed in all kinds of ways, I think that Maria Mies's book, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, nevertheless identified a key problem that, by and large, on the socialist left, we've been very slow to respond to adequately, which is to look at the question of the reproduction of a particular kind of gendered order that she describes as patriarchy on a world scale in relationship to accumulation. And I think she posed the right problem in that book, even though I think it's deeply flawed in all kinds of ways. Had I had a bit more time, I would say something more about where migrant labor figures in that discussion, but I'll simply flag it as something to which I'm happy to return. But if what I'm saying is right at all in this regard, then it seems to me that if we are to develop a politics of working class internationalism that is appropriate to what we would call the age of the highest level of capitalist globalization so far, then those politics of working class internationalism have to be more fundamentally, at the most bedrock level, socialist, feminist, and anti-racist than previous iterations of working class internationalism. And that, it seems to me, follows both from the nature of capitalist globalization itself, but also the complex social processes by which a global working class has been constructed in and around both its class dimensions as well as its racial and gendered forms. And I think, as I say, that those pose unique problems of both theory and practice for those of us on the socialist left today. Okay, I'll stop.